So the question then to me is, why have we been successful at regulating other emissions in a period when we've seemed to significantly prioritize GHG reductions, and we haven't made much action? And in fact, if you're talking about a 40% or 60% reduction, again, when economic activity is rising, something's going on here that doesn't align with carbon. So what's unique or interesting about these other pollutants?
So I'd say there's an awful lot of factors that make those types of pollutants unique, and I'll go through some of them. One that I think is quite striking when you compare it to greenhouse gas emissions, it's one that I've talked about previously, is the fact that they're predominantly local pollutants. And so what I mean by local pollutants is that when an emission of, say, sulfur dioxide is produced, it stays, reasonably contained within the local airshed. And so, for example, when a power plant emits sulfur dioxide pollutant, it sticks around in the air and causes pollution damage for a few days, 5 days, for example. But by 5 days, wind and rain has basically worked the sulfur dioxide that was emitted out of the air and back into the process of being reassimilated. And so, because it stays in the air for a relatively short period of time, it doesn't have the chance to move really, really long distances. And this is in contrast to something like carbon dioxide emissions, which end up staying in the atmosphere for probably somewhere on the neighborhood of 100 years. And because carbon dioxide has such a long residence time in the atmosphere, it has the chance to basically spread itself around the globe when it's emitted by a plant. And so carbon dioxide emissions we call global. When a factory puts out carbon dioxide or some other greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't concentrate its negative effects in the local region. It spreads its negative effects, the climate change effects, throughout the whole world. And the reason I think that's important as a characteristic for these pollutants is because the scale of our regulatory response is typically as a better match for these local pollutants than it is for the global pollutants. In the case of lead emissions, for example, it was pretty easy to demonstrate that there were some local effects. Government was well placed to say, if we regulate, we're going to derive a lot of benefits, local benefits from removing lead from gasoline, and improve children's health, for example. In the case of climate change, it's more difficult to make that case, because when Canada, for example, or another country regulates an emitter to force it to produce less carbon dioxide, it doesn't just benefit Canada. The benefits are really diffuse. So you don't get this really concentrated set of benefits like you do with other pollutants. So this is one of the big features, I would argue, that has made our progress on local pollutants quite distinct from our progress on global pollutants like carbon dioxide. In a lot of cases, these pollutants where we've been fairly successful have stemmed from a kind of a unique use in the economy. And again, this is distinct from carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is produced in virtually every activity, throughout industry, throughout transportation, and so it's more difficult for government to really use, to pinpoint exactly what activity it should regulate. A third reason is the kind of what I'm going to call tangibility. In the case of lead, for example, we could really identify quite clearly that there was deterioration in children's health, neurological problems associated with lead emissions, and we could see that those were more concentrated in areas where gasoline consumption was high than in areas where gasoline consumption was low. And so we could really make the case quite clearly and unambiguously that there would be a benefit from reducing lead emissions. In the case of carbon, the benefits, although it's been quite clearly communicated in the scientific literature that there's a real downside to carbon emissions in the form of, say, melting ice sheets or and potential for significant warming and decreased agricultural yields, or changes in water availability. The tangibility of this kind of impact, I would argue, is much lower.
To sum up, we've been successful in controlling some of these pollutants in time for a number of reasons. A big reason you're citing is sort of the local and certain benefits compared to sort of diffuse and global, and the temporal aspect as well. We're not quite sure when they're going to occur. We're not quite sure who they're going to benefit, and we kind of know for sure they're not going to benefit us currently, whereas the costs of regulatory action are now and fairly certain and well known. And this notion of local and significant damages is pretty powerful, isn't it? Children's health is very powerful. I mean, it drives regulatory action.
Right. Cause and effect are more clear.
Cause and effect are more clear. The tangibility is a really interesting idea, and the short-term tangibility. seeing improvements in lakes with acid rain, for example, and fish counts. I mean, that's a very powerful message. A government can point to it and say, hey, look,
Yeah,
we have some results.
absolutely.